Have you ever wondered what breaks a human being? It is not a gunshot or a death certificate. It is the click of a lock turned from the inside by your own flesh and blood, abandoning you and your 105-year-old father in -15-degree snow. That night, I thought I lost everything. I was wrong. That blizzard was merely the curtain rising on a bloodless slaughter where the hunter became the prey. Hello, dear listeners of James' Revenge Stories. Before we begin today's tale, I want to sincerely thank you for being the heart of our community. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to afford their daily living expenses and continue creating these incredible stories to serve you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code directly on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Thank you for your incredible kindness. Now, let me introduce myself. My name is Eva Gardner, and this is my story. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of Aspen, Colorado on a Christmas Eve that felt less like a holiday and more like a cruel, calculated punishment. The temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees, turning the mountain air into millions of invisible razor blades that slashed ruthlessly at exposed skin. I am 45 years old, but in that exact moment, shivering uncontrollably on the expansive limestone patio of what used to be my own home, I felt utterly ancient and broken. My hands, entirely numb and cracking at the knuckles, gripped the freezing rubber handles of a heavy steel wheelchair. Sitting in that chair was my father, Arthur. He was 105 years old. For the past 8 years, he had been trapped in the silent, vacant labyrinth of severe dementia, stripped of his brilliant mind and his voice. He sat there, frail and completely unmoving, a silent, tragic witness to the ultimate betrayal. Just inches away from us, separated only by a thick wall of reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass, was a completely different universe. It was a world of enveloping warmth, glowing golden light, and the soft, mocking clink of crystal champagne flutes. It was a sprawling mansion built of modern glass and rich oak, a fortress I had paid for with my own sweat, blood, and tears. Inside, a lavish celebration was in full swing. At the absolute center of the opulent room stood my ex-husband, Marcus, and my own flesh and blood, my 24-year-old son, Julian. They were dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored tuxedos, laughing loudly, raising triumphant toasts to the elite crowd of wealthy investors and socialites who had gathered to witness my execution. They were celebrating their highly successful, incredibly hostile takeover of Aegis Horizon Solutions. Aegis Horizon was not just a business to me. It was a billion-dollar cybersecurity firm I had built from absolute scratch over 20 years of grueling labor, while Marcus played golf and Julian drained his trust funds. Through the thick, frost-covered glass, I could see Julian smiling. It was a cruel, highly practiced smile. The exact kind of smile a predator wears when the hunt is officially over and the prey is cornered. Then, the heavy oak double doors swung open, allowing a brief, agonizing blast of warm, cedar-scented air to hit my freezing face. Julian stepped out onto the snowy patio. The vibrant music and warm laughter spilled out behind him, acting as a deeply insulting soundtrack to my absolute misery. He did not look at me with the eyes of a son. He looked at me like I was a disgusting infestation that needed to be exterminated. Without offering a single word of greeting, Julian stepped forward aggressively and grabbed the thin wool blanket draped over my father's trembling shoulders. With a violent, deeply disrespectful jerk, he ripped it away and let it drop casually onto the snow-covered limestone. "You are polluting the view, Mother," Julian said, his voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any human empathy. "Your presence and his is dirtying this space. This is an environment for the elite. My guests are becoming visibly uncomfortable looking at this pathetic display through the glass." I stared at the boy I had carried, birthed, and sacrificed my entire youth to raise. "He is your grandfather, Julian," I whispered, my voice incredibly hoarse from the screaming, freezing wind. "He is 105 years old. It is minus 15 degrees out here. Please, I am begging you, just let him sit inside the heated foyer until the medical transport arrives." Julian scoffed, a short, incredibly ugly sound of pure disdain. He reached into the inner silk pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal parchment paper, along with a heavy silver fountain pen. He held them out to me, the thick paper snapping frantically in the brutal blizzard wind. "This is a final relinquishment of all your remaining founders' rights and equity shares to Aegis Horizon," Julian stated coldly, his eyes dead and unfeeling. "Sign it right now. If you sign it, I will generously pay for a bottom-tier nursing home for the old man for the next 6 months. If you refuse, you both get off my property tonight. Right now. Out into the freezing street." I looked down at the legal document, then looked past Julian to Marcus, who was watching intently from the warmth of the living room, swirling his expensive bourbon with a sickening smirk of absolute victory. They had already taken the company using dirty legal maneuvers. They had taken my life savings, my home, my reputation, and my legacy. Now they wanted my total, unconditional surrender in exchange for my father's most basic survival. They wanted to break my spirit entirely and permanently. I looked down at my father. His eyes were milky and clouded, staring blankly ahead at the swirling, chaotic snow. I thought about the proud, powerful man he used to be, the unyielding pride he carried every day of his life, and the immense strength he had instilled in me since I was a little girl. To sign that paper was to validate their vile theft, to bow down to a heartless monster I had accidentally created and nurtured. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute, carrying the weight of my final stand. "I will not sign." Julian's jaw tightened dangerously. His eyes darkened with genuine, unfiltered malice. "Then take the useless trash and get off my mountain," he hissed. He turned his back on me, stepped back inside the warm mansion, and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The sound that followed was the most terrifying, definitive sound I had ever heard in my entire 45 years of life. The loud, heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt locking firmly from the inside. They had literally locked us out, in the middle of a massive blizzard. It was a guaranteed death sentence. The deadly cold immediately began to claim us. The snow was already accumulating rapidly, piling up high against the spokes and wheels of my father's chair. I knew deep in my bones that no transport was coming. Julian had surely canceled it to ensure our suffering. I had no phone, no money, no keys, and absolutely no shelter. The nearest public road was over 2 miles down a steep, treacherous, winding mountain driveway, which was already completely buried under knee-deep snow. Panic rose in my chest, sharp, burning, and suffocating. I fell hard to my knees in the snow, frantically grabbing the discarded wool blanket, aggressively shaking the ice off it, and tucking it tightly back around my father's frail body. But it was mathematically not enough to save him. He was shaking violently, his lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. Without a second thought, I unzipped my heavy, insulated winter parka, the only piece of clothing keeping my own core temperature viable, and stripped it off entirely. The vicious wind bit into my thin silk blouse immediately, aggressively stealing the breath right out of my burning lungs. I draped the thick coat over Arthur, wrapping it tightly around his fragile torso, cocooning him as best as I physically could. I stood back up, gripping the frozen, unforgiving handles of the wheelchair once again. "Hold on, Dad," I choked out, my teeth chattering uncontrollably in my skull. "I'm going to get us out of here, I promise." I pushed. The wheels spun fruitlessly in the thick, heavy, powdery snow. I put my entire shivering body weight into it, groaning loudly with the immense physical effort. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy chair began to move away from the glowing glass cage of the mansion and into the pitch-black, howling abyss of the driveway. Every single step was a violent battle against the elements. The snow was up to my shins, and then quickly up to my knees, Beneath the soft powder lay a highly treacherous, invisible layer of solid black ice. My foot slipped violently. I crashed down hard, the jagged, unforgiving ice tearing right through my thin slacks, slicing deeply into my bare knees. Warm blood trickled down my shins, instantly freezing against my skin the second it hit the air. I forced my screaming muscles to push me back up. I pushed the chair again. 10 yards, 20 yards. The wind shrieked like a dying animal, throwing massive, impenetrable walls of white across my vision. My fingers were no longer functioning fingers. They were useless, entirely numb blocks of frozen wood. My breathing became incredibly shallow, turning into ragged, painful gasps. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a massive, crushing weight pressing heavily down on my chest, slowly forcing my heart to stop beating. I stumbled again, falling brutally hard onto the frozen, unyielding ground. This time I could not find the physical or mental strength to rise. I lay there flat on the ice, staring hopelessly up at the absolute, terrifying darkness of the sky. The blizzard roared furiously around me, but inside my mind, a strange, terrifyingly peaceful quiet began to settle. The burning pain was fading away rapidly. I knew exactly what that meant. Severe hypothermia was finally taking over. I crawled a few desperate inches, wrapping my bleeding, frozen arms tightly around the icy wheels of my father's chair. I buried my freezing face against his knee, simply waiting for the end to come. I had failed him. The darkness was absolute and final. Then, the completely impossible happened. Through the roaring, disorienting whiteout of the storm, a beam of pure, piercing yellow light violently cut through the darkness. Then another, and another. The frozen ground beneath my bleeding body began to vibrate steadily, with a low, incredibly powerful, synchronized hum. It was not the loud, clanking sound of a city snowplow. It sounded exactly like the deep, expensive purr of massive, finely tuned aviation engines. I lifted my incredibly heavy head, squinting painfully through the driving snow and my own frozen, ice-caked eyelashes. Out of the blinding, swirling white night, a phantom fleet magically emerged. They were gliding up the treacherous, unplowed, icy mountain road with impossible, fluid grace. Not just one, but a fleet of 6 magnificent, elongated vintage vehicles. The Lade car, a breathtaking, fully restored classic Duesenberg Model J, gleamed ominously in midnight black, its massive, imposing chrome grille parting the heavy snow effortlessly, just like a grand naval ship cutting through the ocean waves. Following closely behind it, in a perfect, flawless, tightly coordinated military formation, were 5 immaculate black Packard sedans. They did not slip on the ice. They did not hesitate in the deep snow. They moved powerfully, as if the raging storm simply did not exist. The massive fleet smoothly and precisely completely surrounded us, forming a protective, impenetrable, heavily armored steel barricade against the brutal blizzard. The roaring, freezing wind was suddenly and completely blocked off. The dozens of bright headlights illuminated the aggressively falling snow, creating a brilliant, glowing halo of warm light all around us. The suffocating despair of the frozen night shattered into a million pieces in a single instant. The mechanical hum of the engines died away, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the storm itself had been intimidated into submission. 12 doors opened in perfect unison. 12 men in sharp charcoal suits stepped out. They did not rush, nor did they shiver. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized discipline of a special operations unit, fanning out to form a perfect perimeter. Each man held a black, oversized umbrella, their movements so practiced that not a single flake of snow dared to land on the man who emerged last from the lead Duesenberg. He was in his 60s, his hair a distinguished, steely silver, wearing an expensive tailored cashmere overcoat that seemed completely immune to the sub-zero temperatures. He ignored the glowing, smug lights of the mansion behind us entirely, as if it were nothing more than a trivial pile of bricks. He walked straight toward my father, his boots crunching rhythmically on the ice. When he reached us, He did not offer a hand to help me up from the frozen ground. Instead, he did something that stopped my heart cold. He dropped to his knees, his polished Oxford sinking into the snow, and lowered his head in a gesture of absolute, profound reverence. "Mr. Vance, the network is active," the man whispered, his voice steady and calm against the howling wind. "My deepest apologies for keeping you waiting." I stared at him, my brain refusing to process the scene. Mr. Vance? That was my father's surname, a name he had not used in over 40 years. Before I could find my voice to ask what kind of insanity was unfolding, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Arthur, but it was not the frail, trembling hand of the invalid I had been caring for. The grip was firm, steady, and strangely heavy. I looked up. Arthur was sitting upright in the chair, his posture rigid and commanding. The vacant, milky haze that had clouded his eyes for 8 years was gone. They were sharp, piercingly blue, and filled with a cold, terrifying intellect. He blinked, a rapid, rhythmic series of shutter-like motions. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It was a perfect, unmistakable burst of Morse code. He reached out, his weathered fingers tenderly brushing a stray lock of frozen hair from my forehead. "You did well, Ava," he said, his voice deep, resonant, and completely clear. "You refused to break. You refused to sign their paper. You maintained your dignity when they tried to strip it away. Now it is my turn." I gasped, my breath hitching in my frozen lungs. "Dad, what is this?" The man in the cashmere coat stood up, gesturing to one of the younger aides, who immediately produced a heavy, heated thermal blanket and wrapped it securely around my shivering body. He looked at me with an expression of intense respect. "My name is Elias, and I am the primary architect of the Sentinel Ledger," the man explained, his words rapid and precise. "Your father is not a retired engineer, Miss Gardner. He is the architect. For over 4 decades, he has been building the most sophisticated encrypted financial network in existence. It controls the liquidity flow of more than 700 global corporations. Every significant transfer of wealth, every dark money movement, and every major corporate merger on the planet passes through his system. It is the invisible spine of the modern global economy." I felt the ground spinning. 8 years, I stammered, looking at my father. 8 years of silence. 8 years of not knowing your own daughter. Why? Arthur looked toward the mansion, his face hardening into a mask of pure, cold steel. "The system I built is too powerful to exist in the hands of the reckless," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I needed to become a ghost to protect it. I needed to see who would try to steal the keys to the kingdom. For 8 years I have been watching Marcus. I have been watching the greed eat him alive, and I have been watching the monster grow inside Julian. I needed to know if you were truly my daughter, Eva. I needed to see if you would ever prioritize your own survival over your integrity, even when pushed to the absolute brink of death." The realization hit me harder than the cold. I had been a test subject. I had been a piece on a chessboard I did not know existed. The pain of Julian's betrayal, which had been burning in my chest just minutes ago, began to crystallize into something else. It was no longer just heartbreak. It was a cold, sharp, dangerous focus. I looked at the mansion again. The house that felt like a prison now looked like a playpen for children who had no idea they were playing with live grenades. "They think they won," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried a new, unfamiliar authority. "They believe they have seized your company and destroyed your family," Arthur replied, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "They believe that because they only see the surface. They have no idea that the foundation they are standing on is made of glass. And today, we are going to shatter it." Elias bowed slightly, holding the door of the Lee Duesenberg open. The interior was glowing with soft, amber light, smelling of expensive leather and dry heat. It was a sanctuary. Arthur stood up from the wheelchair. He did not need it, and walked toward the vehicle with a steady, commanding gait. He stopped and turned back to look at me, his eyes searching mine. "Are you ready to stop being the victim, Eva?" he asked. Are you ready to become the architect of their destruction? I looked at the mansion one last time. I thought of Julian, the son who had locked his own mother into a grave of ice for a stock option. I thought of Marcus, the man who had sold his soul for a seat at a table that was about to be burned to the ground. My transformation was complete. The victim had died in the snow, and in her place, something far more dangerous had been born. I walked toward the car, my head held high, and stepped out of the freezing nightmare and into the warm, absolute power of the future. Stepping out of the howling sub-zero blizzard and into the rear cabin of the vintage Duesenberg was like crossing a hidden threshold between two entirely different centuries. From the outside, the vehicle was a magnificent relic of the 1930s, but the interior was a breathtaking, heavily armored mobile command center. The scent of aged, rich mahogany and fine leather was immediately overpowered by the low, steady hum of military-grade server racks concealed beneath the floorboards. High-definition, tactical touchscreens seamlessly replaced the traditional partition separating us from the driver's compartment. The heavy doors sealed shut with a pressurized hiss, instantly cutting off the violent roar of the storm outside. Arthur settled into the plush, heated captain's chair with the casual authority of an emperor reclaiming his throne. He reached out and handed me a sleek, matte black tablet. Its screen was heavily encrypted, glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. "Open it," he instructed, his voice slicing through the quiet cabin. "It is time you reviewed the actual architecture of your own downfall. You have been fighting ghosts, Ava. Now you will look the demons directly in the eye." I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The tablet unlocked instantly, flooding the screen with a massive, meticulously organized database of intercepted communications. Private financial ledgers and heavily classified internal documents stolen directly from the servers of Aegis Horizon Solutions. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I opened the primary folder labeled with my son's name. "I thought Marcus manipulated him," I whispered, desperately clinging to the last fragile thread of my maternal instinct. "I thought Marcus poisoned his mind against me." Arthur did not say a word. He simply tapped a video file dated exactly 6 months ago. The screen flickered, revealing crystal clear, hidden camera footage of the grand marble kitchen inside the mansion I had just been exiled from. The camera angle was positioned high above the custom cabinetry. There was Julian, my son. He was standing casually by the expensive espresso machine, wearing a relaxed cashmere sweater. Marcus was leaning against the island counter across from him. I watched, completely paralyzed, as Julian pulled a tiny, unmarked glass vial from his pocket. With practiced, terrifyingly steady hands, he uncorked it and carefully tapped a fine, colorless powder into my personal, custom-blended morning tea. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me as I tapped the audio icon. The sound of their voices filled the quiet cabin, clear and undeniably real. "It is completely untraceable," Julian said on the recording, his tone chillingly conversational and devoid of any hesitation. "It is a highly specialized synthetic neurotoxin I procured from a contact in Eastern Europe. If administered consistently over a period of 4 to 5 months, it perfectly mimics the progressive, undeniable symptoms of early-onset dementia and severe nervous breakdown. The board of directors will have absolutely no choice but to invoke the medical incapacity clause written in her founder's contract. I become the permanent legal proxy. The company is ours, and her reputation is simply chalked up to tragic genetics. She will not even know what hit her." The breath violently left my lungs. The horror of the revelation was absolute. For the past half-year, I had been trapped in a waking nightmare. I had suffered through debilitating migraines, sudden memory lapses, and terrifying bouts of paranoia. I had visited 5 different top-tier neurologists, crying myself to sleep every night in sheer terror, believing I was inheriting the exact same degenerative brain disease I thought had claimed my father. All the while, my own child, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, the boy I had sacrificed 20 years of my life to protect, was systematically, patiently poisoning me every single morning with a warm, loving smile on his face. He was not a pawn. Julian was the ruthless, calculating mastermind. The sheer psychopathy of his plot stripped away the very last remaining shreds of my maternal denial. "And Marcus?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous, hollow register I did not even recognize as my own. Arthur swiped his hand across the main monitor panel mounted on the partition. A complex, interconnected web of offshore banking charts and high-risk loan agreements appeared in glaring red graphics. "Your ex-husband is a spectacular fool," Arthur stated flatly, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the screens. "In his pathetic desperation to match your immense self-made success, he secretly mortgaged every single legitimate asset he possessed. He borrowed over $45 million from highly unregulated shadow credit organizations to pump directly into Julian's aggressive, highly leveraged investment funds. Marcus believed he was making backroom deals with ruthless Russian syndicates and untraceable cartels." Arthur smiled, a terrifying predator finally showing its teeth. "He was dealing entirely with me. Every single shell company, every phantom creditor that handed Marcus that massive line of credit was a subsidiary fully controlled by the Sentinel Ledger." The pieces of the puzzle began locking into place with terrifying mathematical precision. I looked out the reinforced window toward the trailing vehicle, thinking of the heavy steel wheelchair currently folded in its trunk. "The chair," I whispered in absolute disbelief. "You told me you were watching them." Arthur nodded slowly, his posture unyielding. "That wheelchair was not medical equipment, Eva. It was a custom-built military-grade signal transceiver. For 8 long, agonizing years, they looked at me and saw a drooling, pathetic vegetable. But every seemingly random twitch of my fingers, every erratic tap on the armrest, was a highly encrypted micro-command routed directly into the global financial network. I was not just sitting there watching them. I was actively, patiently building a massive, inescapable digital cage around their entire financial ecosystem, line by line, tap by tap. I meticulously wove the noose, and they eagerly, greedily placed their own heads right inside it. The sheer scale of his silent operation was staggering. "And what happens now?" I asked, looking directly into my father's sharp, calculating eyes. Arthur pointed a steady finger toward the largest tactical screen in the center console. "Now, we pull the lever." The massive screen immediately split into a live, real-time execution dashboard. On the left side, a high-definition video feed transmitted from a stealth micro-drone, positioned perfectly outside the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, showed the opulent party continuing inside. Julian was standing confidently on the grand oak staircase, raising a sparkling crystal flute of vintage champagne, his handsome face flushed with the absolute, intoxicating arrogance of a conqueror. On the right side of the screen, a complex bar graph tracking the global liquidity of Julian's funds and Marcus's borrowed capital glowed in bright neon green. "Execute Protocol Absolute Zero," Arthur commanded softly into a secure microphone embedded in his collar. Instantly, the neon green graph turned a violent, flashing crimson red. The numbers began to free fall at a dizzying, catastrophic speed. Millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. The Sentinel Ledger's automated algorithms were mercilessly executing margin calls, liquidating physical assets, and forcefully draining every single shadow account Julian and Marcus possessed across the entire globe. In the span of exactly 45 seconds, I watched an arrogant, bloated empire built on deceit and poison evaporate into absolute zero. I stared intensely at the screen, watching Julian smile as he drank his champagne, completely unaware that he was now financially dead. He was a walking corpse in a tailored tuxedo. At that precise moment, the deep, agonizing grief that had paralyzed me out in the freezing snow simply vanished. The weeping, broken mother who had begged for her father's life had perished entirely on that icy patio. In her place, a profound, terrifyingly calm clarity took deep root in my chest. The sacred love I had held for my son had been brutally weaponized against me. They had trampled my soul and tried to destroy my mind just to feed their pathetic, insatiable ambition. They wanted to see me broken, homeless, and insane. Instead, they had successfully forged me into a weapon. The sadness was completely dead. All that remained in my veins was a razor-sharp, unbreakable will for absolute, uncompromising vengeance. On the high-definition tactical screen, the precise moment of execution was a masterpiece of silent, digital warfare. Julian had just proudly raised his crystal flute of champagne to his lips, basking in the warm, sycophantic applause of the crowded room. Then, a sharp, piercing chime echoed from the front row of the gathered elite. A second chime followed immediately. Then 10, then 50. Within the span of exactly 5 seconds, the grand, opulent living room was entirely swallowed by a chaotic, overlapping symphony of custom ringtones, emergency text alerts, and priority banking notifications. Every single wealthy investor, every corrupt board member who had eagerly conspired against me, pulled out their cell phones in perfect unison. The warm, golden, ambient lighting of the mansion reflected off dozens of faces that simultaneously drained of all human color. Through the high-resolution camera feed, I could clearly read the stark, glaring red text flashing across the screen of a prominent venture capitalist standing near the window. Margin call. Urgent liquidation protocol initiated. Account permanently frozen. The Sentinel ledger was not merely attacking Julian and Marcus. It was surgically and mercilessly dismantling the entire financial network of enablers who had funded their hostile takeover. Confusion rapidly curdled into outright, animalistic panic. Angry shouts erupted across the room. Expensive champagne flutes slipped from trembling fingers, shattering violently against the pristine hardwood floors. Julian, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, lowered his glass. His highly practiced, confident smile faltered and collapsed. He reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket and retrieved his own device. I watched his thumbs move furiously across the screen, desperately trying to log into his private offshore banking portals. Access denied. 0 balance. He switched applications, frantically trying to override the security protocols of the Aegis Horizon mainframes. A stark black screen blinked back at him with a single, damning line of text. Master credentials permanently revoked. "Everybody remain calm!" Julian shouted over the growing, deafening hysteria, his voice cracking with the very first genuine note of absolute terror. "It is just a server routing glitch. I will have the engineering team reset the mainframes immediately." He marched aggressively over to the smart home control panel mounted on the custom oak wall, aggressively tapping the glass interface to restore order. That was the exact moment Arthur executed the secondary command protocol. The massive, glowing glass mansion plunged instantly into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The intelligent home system, the radiant heating grid, the biometric perimeter security, and the heavy-duty backup generators were entirely and permanently wiped out by a targeted electromagnetic override. The lively jazz music died instantly. The only light remaining in the cavernous room came from the frantic sweeping beams of 50 cell phone flashlights and the blinding, raging blizzard pressing against the glass outside. Then, the heavy oak double doors, the very same doors Julian had cruelly locked behind me just 1 hour ago, exploded inward with a deafening, splintering crash. It was not the local Aspen Police Department. Through the drone's advanced infrared feed, I watched a heavily armed tactical unit flood the grand foyer. They moved with aggressive, terrifyingly practiced military efficiency. Emblazoned across their heavy Kevlar vests were the bold, reflective white letters of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Cybercrime Task Force. "Federal agents, nobody moves a single muscle," a commanding voice roared through a heavy-duty megaphone, cutting sharply through the darkness and the screaming guests. High-powered, weapon-mounted flashlights blinded the elite crowd, pinning the billionaires and socialites against the walls like trapped, pathetic insects. Julian backed away slowly, his hands trembling violently in the harsh light. "You have absolutely no legal jurisdiction here," he stammered, desperately trying to project a hollow authority. "This is private property. I demand you leave." From the deep shadows behind the heavily armed tactical agents, 3 men in immaculate charcoal gray suits stepped forward. They were Arthur's personal legal executioners, moving with the terrifying, unhurried calmness of undertakers. The lead lawyer clicked a silver pen, illuminated perfectly by an agent's flashlight, and placed a thick, leather-bound legal folder onto the marble kitchen island. "Actually, Mr. Gardner, it is no longer your property," the lead attorney stated, his voice perfectly modulated, razor-sharp, and painfully loud in the terrified, silent room. "You blatantly violated the shadow covenants of your primary mortgage exactly 3 months ago. Your anonymous creditors instantly seized the collateral. This entire estate was purchased at a private, sealed auction by a holding company fully owned and operated by Miss Eva Gardner. You are currently trespassing on her private estate. Furthermore, the authorities are here to execute a federal, no-knock warrant for massive wire fraud, international corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit murder via chemical poisoning." The word poisoning echoed violently off the glass walls. The wealthy investors, already frantic about their vanishing wealth, stepped away from Julian as if he were actively leaking a deadly radioactive plague. Marcus, who had been cowardly hiding behind the grand piano, suddenly lunged forward into the light. The smug, victorious ex-husband I had known was completely gone, replaced by a sweating, desperate, pathetic animal caught securely in a steel trap. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, violently shoving his own son against the nearest wall. "Tell them," Marcus screamed, spit flying from his trembling lips. "Tell the federal agents you did this entirely on your own. You bought the synthetic neurotoxin from Eastern Europe. You poisoned your own mother's tea every single morning. I was just a silent financial observer. I did not touch the dirty money. I am fully cooperating with the federal government." Julian shoved his father back with brutal force, his handsome face twisting into a hideous mask of pure, ugly hatred. "You cowardly, useless parasite!" Julian roared back, his voice echoing with madness. "You eagerly signed the fraudulent loan documents. You illegally mortgaged every single asset you had to fund my accounts. You are going to rot in a federal penitentiary right next to me." They began physically tearing at each other, scratching, punching, and clawing like feral dogs fighting over a rotting scrap of meat. The expensive, custom-tailored suits ripped at the seams. Blood smeared across the pristine white marble floor. The elite, sophisticated, untouchable facade of high society was stripped completely bare, revealing the pathetic, greedy, cannibalistic cowards underneath. The federal agents did not even rush to stop them immediately. They simply stood back and let the 2 men completely humiliate themselves in front of their former friends and colleagues before finally stepping in to violently slam them face first onto the floor, securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around their wrists. I watched the entire chaotic spectacle unfold from the absolute serene silence of the Duesenberg's rear cabin. Elias, the man in the cashmere coat, had smoothly driven us exactly 1 mile up the winding mountain ridge. We were now parked on a secure, scenic overlook, gazing directly down at the valley below. Elias poured steaming, highly fragrant Earl Grey tea from a polished silver thermos into 2 delicate porcelain cups, respectfully handing one to my father and one to me. The intense heat of the cup seeped beautifully into my previously frozen, blood-stained hands. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was perfectly brewed, warming my chest instantly. Far below us, the pitch-black estate was now illuminated by a frantic, blinding sea of flashing red and blue police lights, tearing violently through the swirling white snow. It looked exactly like a sinking luxury ship sending out its final, desperate distress flares into a cold, uncaring ocean. There were absolutely no tears left in my eyes. There was no screaming, no need for a dramatic face-to-face confrontation. I did not need to stand in that freezing room and yell to prove my ultimate victory. True, absolute power does not ever need to raise its voice. It simply alters the fundamental reality of its enemies, locks the doors from the outside, and peacefully watches them suffocate in the terrifying new atmosphere they created for themselves. Elias steered the heavy Duesenberg back down the winding mountain road, the thick tires crunching softly and methodically over the fresh powder. We pulled into the grand circular driveway of the estate just as the federal agents were beginning to march their newly acquired prisoners out into the freezing night. The aggressively flashing blue and red lights painted the driving snow in violent, alternating colors. The sheer irony of the scene was profound and heavy. Exactly 2 hours ago, I was bleeding on this very ice, desperately begging for a fraction of basic human decency. Now, I was returning inside an armored, invincible fortress to silently witness the absolute, undeniable destruction of my tormentors. Through the shattered remains of the heavy oak doors, Julian stumbled violently out into the biting wind. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable prince of the corporate boardroom. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was ripped cleanly at the shoulder seam, and his expensive silk bow tie dangled pathetically from his collar like a broken noose. His crisp white dress shirt was heavily stained with his father's blood and his own terrified sweat. For a brief, chaotic second, he managed to wrench his handcuffed arms away from the federal agent gripping his collar. He took 3 desperate, highly uncoordinated steps toward the dark driveway before his expensive leather shoes completely lost their grip on the treacherous black ice. He collapsed heavily. His knees struck the exact same patch of frozen limestone where I had fallen just 120 minutes earlier. The brutal, unforgiving cold immediately began to seep into his thin clothing, but he did not seem to notice the physical pain. His wild, panicked eyes locked instantly onto the massive, gleaming chrome grille of the Duesenberg, idling silently in the snow. He knew perfectly well who held the reins of that impossible machine. "Mother!" he screamed. The word tore painfully from his throat, a raw, primal sound of absolute desperation that echoed off the dark mountain ridges. He began to violently drag his body across the snow, writhing and pulling himself forward like a crushed snake. He completely ignored the federal agents who were calmly walking up behind him to secure his chains. "Mother, please, you have to stop this right now." I placed my hand on the heavy, polished door handle. Arthur looked at me from the deep shadows of the rear cabin, offering absolutely no advice, no interference, and no judgment. This was my final, defining test. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the freezing storm. The wind aggressively whipped my hair across my face, but I did not shiver. The thermal heat of the car still clung to my skin, and the ice running through my veins was far colder than the weather. Julian looked up at me from the dirty, trampled snow. Hot tears streamed rapidly down his bruised face, freezing almost instantly against his pale cheeks. "Please, Mother, they are talking about 30 years. Julian sobbed uncontrollably, his forehead resting heavily against the frozen ground. 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I'm only 24 years old. My entire life will be completely over before it even starts. It was all Marcus. He manipulated me from the beginning. He poisoned my mind against you. I was just young and stupid. You have all this unimaginable power now. You control the ledger. You can make the federal charges disappear. You can pay the bail money. Please, I am begging you. I am your own son." I looked down at the pathetic, shivering creature groveling at my winter boots. A normal, conventional mother might have felt a sudden, blinding surge of irrational mercy. A normal mother might have reached down, wiped his frozen tears, and promised to hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country. But I was no longer that woman. As I stared deeply into his tear-streaked face, I did not see a frightened child. I vividly saw the cold, highly calculated smirk he wore when he casually poured synthetic neurotoxin into my morning teacup. I saw the vicious, entirely dismissive flick of his wrist as he threw a 105-year-old man's only source of warmth onto the freezing ground. I saw a ruthless monster who would gladly step over my rotting corpse just to increase his profit margins by a single percentage point. I took one deliberate step closer, ensuring he could see the absolute, terrifying emptiness in my eyes. The howling wind seemed to die down for a single, defining moment. "My company can create protective shields," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing air without a single tremor of emotion or hesitation. "But there is no firewall that can stop rot from the inside." Julian's mouth opened in silent, complete devastation. The very final shred of hope drained entirely from his body, leaving him a hollow shell. I did not offer him another word. I simply turned my back on him, the heavy snow crunching sharply beneath my boots, and climbed back into the warm, brilliantly illuminated sanctuary of the Duesenberg. The heavy door clicked shut, severing my connection to him forever. I did not bother to look out the reinforced window as the federal agents finally grabbed him by the shoulders, dragging his violently thrashing body toward the armored transport van. His agonizing screams faded into the howling storm, leaving nothing but a long, pathetic trench in the pristine white snow. By the time the sun rose over the frozen peaks the following morning, the world had entirely shifted on its axis. The largest, most globally respected financial news broadcasting networks across the United States of America simultaneously interrupted their scheduled programming for a massive breaking story. Every single piece of undeniable, mathematically proven evidence that Arthur had meticulously gathered over 8 long years had been anonymously leaked to the international press. The television screens flashed with horrifying, highly detailed accounts of the Marcus and Julian empire. The anchors spoke with grim fascination, detailing the total evaporation of hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of mere seconds. Pundits openly debated the sheer audacity of a 24-year-old hedge fund manager attempting to slowly poison his own mother to seize her billionaire status. Their toxic assets were completely frozen by the government. Their elite, wealthy friends publicly disavowed them within seconds of the broadcast. Their reputation, their wealth, and their freedom were utterly, irreversibly obliterated. Nobody on earth could save them now. Exactly 1 month later, the brutal winter winds of Colorado were nothing but a fading, distant memory. I stepped out of the private, highly secure elevator and into the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling glass office situated on the absolute highest floor of a towering, unmarked skyscraper in downtown Chicago. I was no longer the shivering, broken victim bleeding on a freezing patio. I was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue executive suit that fit and felt exactly like a modern suit of armor. Every single step I took across the polished Italian marble floor resonated with absolute, unquestionable authority. Arthur was waiting for me. He was not slumped over in a heavy steel wheelchair. He sat elegantly upright in a massive, tufted leather armchair, the bright morning sunlight illuminating the sharp, incredibly intelligent angles of his face. As I approached his massive mahogany desk, he reached into his inner coat pocket and placed a small, intricately carved wooden box onto the polished surface. He pushed it gently toward me. I slowly opened the heavy lid. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of rich black velvet, was not a stack of offshore bank account numbers or traditional financial documents. It was a single, glowing, quantum drive. The Sentinel ledger was never just a shadow financial fund, Ava, Arthur said, his deep voice echoing powerfully in the quiet, cavernous room. It is a highly advanced, fully autonomous artificial intelligence system. I specifically designed it to be the ultimate, completely silent predator of the corrupt elite. Its primary, unalterable directive is to automatically identify, secretly infiltrate, and permanently freeze the global financial assets of massive corporations and international syndicates that engage in severe labor exploitation, human trafficking, and systemic domestic violence on a global scale. It is an invisible sword forged entirely to protect the vulnerable. I looked down at the glowing drive, the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of his life's work finally sinking deep into my mind. I remained completely silent for 8 agonizing years, Arthur continued, leaning forward intensely in his chair. I did it to test your spirit, yes, but primarily I had to wait. I had to wait until the proprietary cybersecurity algorithms you were personally developing at Aegis Horizon Solutions reached absolute, uncrackable perfection. The ledger needed a flawless, impenetrable digital shield before it could safely merge and fully awaken. Your technology was the final, critical missing piece. A cold, deeply satisfying realization washed entirely over me. Julian and Marcus, I whispered. They stole my company just to liquidate its basic market value. Arthur smiled warmly, a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold vengeance we had unleashed. Exactly. Your ex-husband and your own son committed massive federal crimes and entirely destroyed their own lives to steal your company, completely oblivious to the ultimate cosmic irony. The core source code of Aegis Horizon was the singular, necessary quantum cipher required to unlock the entire, multi-trillion-dollar treasury of my network. They literally held the master key to the universe right in their greedy, pathetic hands. But their vision was far too small, too entirely corrupted by petty, miserable ambition to ever realize what they actually possessed. Equipped with the quantum key and absolute control, my very first order of business was mercilessly precise. That exact same afternoon, I summoned a mandatory emergency shareholder meeting at the newly reclaimed headquarters of Aegis Horizon. 12 men and women sat nervously around the massive oak conference table. These were the exact same 12 board members who had greedily voted to strip my founder rights and happily enabled Marcus just 1 month ago. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely expecting a screaming match. I gave them nothing of the sort. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply placed a single legal mandate onto the center of the table. Using my absolute majority power, I instantly and officially terminated all 12 of them. I utilized hidden breach of contract clauses to legally revoke every single share of their unvested stock, effectively wiping out their entire accumulated wealth. Furthermore, I permanently encoded their identities onto a highly classified global financial blacklist. They walked out of my boardroom in absolute stunned silence, carrying their ruined careers in small cardboard boxes. As the sun began to set over Chicago, painting the massive skyline in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I stood alone before the expansive glass window. The city lights began to flicker on, looking like millions of tiny, glowing circuits in a vast, interconnected machine. I smiled, a genuine, deeply peaceful smile. I had not just recovered the company I built from scratch, I had evolved into the supreme gatekeeper of a terrifying, invincible new empire. I looked down at the bustling, oblivious world below. The absolute greatest, most deeply satisfying revenge is never about aggressively destroying your enemies. It is simply about stripping away all their oxygen, locking the door securely from the outside, and peacefully watching them suffocate inside the very cage of ambition they so eagerly built for themselves. Hello again, dear listeners of James' Revenge Stories. I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me and listening to this incredible journey today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story powerful and entertaining, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to securely pay our hardworking staff, helping them support their families and ensuring we can continue creating even better, more thrilling stories to serve you. Thank you so much, and stay strong.